Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting the armoured fighting vehicles of the Afrika Korp for Flames of War by Battlefront Miniatures. Now Flames of War is a World War II war game at 15mm in scale, which means you get lots of troops and lots of tanks, and it's a game I've been playing myself recently, and the scheme we're going to be showing you in this video is exactly how I've been painting my own tanks. Now as you're going to find, doing this is very easy and very quick as well, and in fact you could paint an entire company of tanks in this colour scheme in a weekend without much of a problem. For our example, we're going to be using a Tiger 1 tank, but it's worth noting that all the techniques apply to any vehicle that you want to paint for the Afrika Korp, and you could also use it to paint other factions in North Africa in 1942 to 43, including the Italians and the British. So we hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you at the desk. To paint your Afrika Korp tanks, the first thing that you need to do is to undercoat your miniatures, and for these ones what I recommend you use is Zandri Dust spray from Citadel, which is actually a very close colour to the colour of the armour of the Afrika Korp tanks, which means it's a great starting point because we can use this as the initial base coat. Now when it comes to painting historical miniatures like this, it's very easy to get hung up on the actual historical colour for things, but bear in mind in real life these vehicles are going to be encountering all sorts of situations that's going to cause variance. I mean, to begin with, depending on the factory, the sort of mix of paint they're using, or the crew when they paint the tank, there's going to be all sorts of differences in the tone here, and then when the vehicle gets into combat and it's in the sun, this is going to change the colour as well. So don't get too worried about it, but if you do want to be as accurate as possible, what I recommend you use is green brown from Vallejo. However, we're going to be using Zandri Dust for this. If you want to go for that other colour, make sure you paint the model entirely at this stage, but what we're going to do is use this as a starting point and start to apply some shading straight over the top of it. Now the great thing about these smaller scale tanks is that the detail becomes much more dense than it does on the larger scale figures, which means we can use some of Citadel's contrast paint and simply paint it straight over, and what this will do is give us that shading and definition. The colour I recommend you use for this colour scheme is some Skeleton Horde, and to apply it, go for a good large brush that can cover areas quickly. In this case I've got a medium shade brush from Citadel, and with this paint I like to make use of a palette to control exactly how much I'm putting on at once. So I'm just going to start out by building up a good little puddle of the paint there like that, and just getting it ready and loaded up on the brush, and then we're ready to start applying it to the miniature. Now remember, even though contrast paint looks like a wash, it actually behaves in a slightly different way, and so what we need to do is think of it as almost colouring in, picking a starting point as if we're using felt tip pens, and then kind of working our way around the vehicle. So I like to start on the front, usually an area like this. All you do is apply this paint to it and then just start pushing it around as far as it will go. And what we're looking for is to get a result kind of like this. So you see it's relatively thin, but it's collecting more in the recessed areas and just staining the hull and making it a little bit darker with that sandy colour. So there we go, just there like that. Now we want to paint this all across the hull and across the turret. Don't worry so much about the tracks, it doesn't matter if you catch those or not, but definitely make sure you get the road wheels as well. And once you have painted it all over, give the tank around about 45 minutes to dry. The contrast paint is now completely dry, and you can see it's given some nice definition on the armour, and so with that done we can now move on to the next step, which is going to be to re-establish that mid-tone and also remove any patchiness the contrast paint may have left behind. So for this what you need to do is return to the colour that you have as the mid-tone on the armour, and I've gone for Zandri Dust, so Zandri Dust is what I'm using here, but remember if you've gone for a different colour, in this case use that one instead. Now once that's done we can then do a little highlight on the model, and for this what we need is a lighter bone colour, and here I'm going to use some Ushabti Bone. But first of all what we need is Zandri Dust, and for this what I'm going for is a soft dry brush across all the armour of the hull of the tank. So I recommend you go for a Citadel dry brush here for these softer bristles these brushes tend to have, and this is a medium dry brush size one. What we need to do is get a small amount of this paint and then work it into the bristles on some tissue and remove the excess. And we're looking to get rid of the vast majority of the paint here, so that's only very light as we apply it to the model. So really make sure, really go at it on that tissue paper until you're having this sort of effect being left behind on the paper, you see. So it's not that much appearing now. And with this, what we need to do then is start applying it to the tank in a kind of slightly circular motion. So the motion is to kind of go at it like this. So you see it's kind of round that I'm going at it. And the more you do this on the armour, the more that colour starts to build up, but still retains that warmth that we got from the contrast paint and also the definition in the recesses. Now the idea here is that we're looking to kind of go over any parts that have gone a little bit patchy. So for example, you can see just on the top of the armour just there is like a little bit of a little slightly more contrast paint, so it's gone a little bit darker. So my goal here is as I dry brush around this area is to just put a little bit more pressure on that part just to make it fade away to help obscure it. Once you've built that colour up to around about this point, you're then ready to move on to Ushabti Bone, and with this, using the same brush, all we need to do is a very light dry brush across all the hull. So very lightly just to dust it so the colour catches on the corners rather than the flats of the armour panels. With that dry brushing done, we're now going to move on to painting some detail on the miniature, starting with the tracks. And to do this, the first thing to do is to stain them with a deep brown colour before we start to build up some effects on them. And for this, Gore-Grunta Fur, another contrast paint, is perfect. Now to apply it, I recommend going for a medium-sized brush. I'm using a medium layer brush from Citadel for this. And definitely use a palette now to control how much of this you're putting on, because we need some control in the application. We need to avoid getting it on the hull as we paint it on to begin with. So make sure you haven't got too much on your brush, and then what you need to do is just start working around the track links, so starting at here for example, and just applying it so it settles in the recessed area and just stains all of it brown. And just be really careful as you get close to the hole, just carefully poking the paint in amongst around the track links there, making sure the colour goes into all the recesses and just following it all the way around. Now this includes bringing it around onto the, well, kind of the inside of them around here, just going up to those wheels, being as careful as possible as you get close to them, just sort of following it around along here. But in addition, what we can do with this is also start to do a little bit of weathering on the tank, because this colour is ideal for it, and the area we're painting is also perfect for this too, because what we need to do is make it a little bit browner in this sort of area beneath the mud guards. So what I recommend you do is apply it around like this, and once you've done so, then just make sure your brush is damp with a bit of water. And to start applying this, just picking up some of that brown paint and just using it to start staining around these areas like this. And doing this is actually really fun and really easy, because as you can see, you can get some really cool kind of streaked effects slowly building up in areas like that. Now you can also build up a little bit more in some areas, such as on the underside of the hull where we'd get a bit of mud and things sort of being kicked up around here. And so what I've got is some of the more concentrated colour, which I'm just going to apply into that area there like that. And then again, just get your brush damp with water and just use that just to pull the colour up a little bit further onto the front of the tank around there, across this bar and a little bit around there. And you can see you can play around with it, poking it around to kind of stain the colour all around areas like that. So now it's just a matter of doing this then on the tracks, also on the wheels, and also a little bit of staining on the back of the hull along there too. Allow the Gore-Grunta Fur to dry completely, and then we can move on to the next stage on the tracks, which is going to be to start to paint some metal on them. And for this, what we need is a dark silver colour. So here I'm going to use some LEadbelcher. And to apply it, go for an older medium-sized brush. I have an older regiment brush here from the Army Painter, because the application here is going to be a little bit like dry brushing, because what we're looking to do is to get some of this colour onto the tracks, but not everywhere, so some of that brown still shows through. So what I recommend you do is get it onto the palette, but this time, don't thin it down with any water. Instead, just get some tissue and just wipe off some excess, just a little bit like that. And then with this, what we need to do is just start lightly brushing it across those links. So for example, these ones here, what I'm looking at doing is just lightly going across like this, just sort of roughly working my way around the track, so you see some of that brown is still showing through randomly in little bits, but there's also a lot of silver building up there too. So we want to go around the side and on the inside as well, wherever it's visible, so lightly just kind of skimming along like that all the way around. Once you've roughly picked out that silver and those links, the next thing to do is to pick out some detail that appears on the wheels, because the Rhodes wheels have got a kind of rubber tyre on them, and for these what we need is an off black. So I'm going to use some Corvus Black for this, and to apply it, definitely go for a small brush, because this is quite intricate here. So what I've got is a small layer brush from Citadel for that control, but any kind of smaller brush like this will do. Now as ever, what you need to do is get that paint nicely thinned down and just test it to make sure it's under control, because with this, the area we're looking at picking out on each of these wheels running along here is going to be this kind of rim that we've got. So you can see it just around here, and all we need to do is just gently allow the brush just to sit in that part and follow the kind of armoured part of the wheel around to get on the other side there like that. And then it's on this side too, and just turn the model as you need to so that you're comfortable as you work around picking out these details. And there we go, I've painted those details on the wheels with Corvus Black, and also I've just painted the inside parts just along there that's visible too black, so just so you don't really notice them once the model's been finished. And with that done, we can now start bringing all the colours together on the tracks by first of all applying a wash to them. Now here what you need is a dark brown wash, so I'm going to use some Agrax Earthshade for this, again applied using that medium shade brush from Citadel, and with this it's just a matter of getting some ready, and I like to use the palette here just to control how much we're putting on. With this colour, what we need to do is paint it over the entire track assembly, including the wheels. So we're looking at all the way around here, just so it runs into all that recessed detail, and bring it all the way around onto all the wheels in here, onto the tyres, everything in this area, to about this sort of level here, so it just stains it and gets some definition in the recesses. Now, in addition, if you've got the spare links like I do on the front of the tank, be sure to get all those too, just being as neat as possible when you get close to the edges of them. And also, if you want to, you can again use this colour just to darken down the underside of the hull a little bit, just like we did with Gore-Grunta Fur. If you want to, it's just a matter of painting it to this sort of area around about here. And like we did with that other colour, just make sure you clean your brush, make sure it's just damp with a little bit of water, and just bring that colour a small distance up so it fades as it goes further up the hull. Allow that wash to dry completely, and then we're ready to really bring everything together by finishing it off with a highlight. And for this, what we need to do is dry brush across all these new colours on the tracks, very lightly with some Ushabti Bone, which might seem a little bit strange at first, but what this will do is give a slightly dusty appearance to things, and it will just really bind everything together with the hull as well. So to do this, what we need to do is a very light dry brush, just like we did when we were doing that light highlight on the hull earlier on, using that medium dry brush once again, and just making sure there's only a very small amount of paint on the brush. Really work it into the bristles and get rid of the excess of the tissue until there's hardly anything left. And then with this, all we've got to do is just lightly start dusting it across the wheels and the tracks. So looking at this area around here, just very lightly along here to get a nice highlight on these details. And with that, the tracks and the wheels are now painted, and so we can move on to some smaller details that appear on the top of the hull of the Tiger. And for this, we're going to start out with all the black and metal details. So things like machine guns and the heads of tools. And for this, what we use some Corvus Black. After that, we're going to use some flat brown from Vallejo, and this is going to be for wooden details on there. Then finally, we need to pick out some metal areas such as the tow cables, and for this, we need some LEadbelcher. But first of all, we need Corvus Black, and to apply it, I'm starting out with that medium layer brush, but it's a good idea to have some smaller brushes on hand for some of the more intricate areas, whatever you're comfortable with really. But as ever, just make sure that paint's nicely thinned down, then it's just a matter of going around the hull looking for these details, and some are quite easy to miss because they tend to be quite small. But first of all, what I recommend you do is look for any machine guns. So we've got this one emerging at the front of the hull just here, so we just want to paint all of this. But then for the tools, what we're looking for is the metal parts of them. So for example, the shovel that we've got on the front of the tank just here, we're looking at painting the head of it just around there, being as neat as possible whenever you get close to the edges, just to avoid getting this colour onto the armour plating. Once you finish picking out all of that metal, you're then ready to move on to a brown. In this case, I'm using flat brown from Vallejo. And with this, what we need to do is to paint the wooden details. So for example, the handles and these tools. And for this, I definitely recommend going from a smaller brush. So in this case, I'm using a small layer brush from Citadel. And then finally, we're ready to pick out all the tow cables on top of the hull using LEadbelcher, again applied using that small layer brush. And with that, all those details have been picked out on top of the hull, and so we can now move on to the next step, which is to apply some shading to them. And for this, what we need is, once again, some Agrax Earthshade, but any dark brown will do for this. And to apply it, I've actually got two brushes. I'm going to start out with a small layer brush for a bit more of a controlled application, which, for this, what we're looking to do is these details that we painted in. We just want to run this colour over the top of them. So you don't need loads, but what you do need to do is just make sure you've got a fairly good point on the brush, and then just start identifying these details and just run the wash over them. So, for example, the shovel just here, just apply it so the colour kind of settles over the top of it and a little bit on either side, so you get that darker line defining it, going all the way around it there like that. So it just helps give it some definition, helps it stand out a little bit more. Now, the reason why I've got the larger brush is for some larger areas that we need to apply the wash to. And so for this, what we're looking at is on the top of the hull where the turret ring is, so to apply a thin coat to this across this area here. So what this is going to do is just darken down the area where the turret moves and give the impression of some grease and grime. So all the way around here. Now, also with this colour, what we can do, again using this brush, is just apply a little bit into the exhaust venting that we've got around the top here. So these kind of vents that are the access to the engine, just dot it in like this, so it just darkens down those recesses as well. And with all those little details now shaded, we can move on to highlighting all of these, and keeping in with the sort of sandy, dusty theme that we got for this colour scheme, what we need to do is again lightly dry brush them using a Ushabti Bone. So for this, again, go for that medium-sized dry brush. I've got my medium dry brush here from Citadel, and this time it's going to be a very light dry brush. So really make sure that you've only got a very small amount of paint left in your brush before you start to apply it to the miniature, by just really working away a lot of that paint on some tissue until you're getting this sort of result. And then all we've got to do is very lightly flick it back and forth across these new details. So all these ones around here, just very gently back and forth like this to get a little bit of this colour on the raised areas, and so give these details a little highlight. Once you finish highlighting all those details with that dry brush, you're then ready to apply any decals you might want to put onto the tank. And in this case, I'm going to go for some numbers on the turret on either side. And also I'm going to put a little marking on the side of the hull as well. And once that's done, we'll come back and do some weathering to finish the miniature off. I've applied the decals to the tank now and been sure to seal them down with a little bit of varnish, and with that done we're now ready for some final effects on the tank to really complete it. And here we're just going to do a little bit of weathering. Now remember, as this is a smaller scale tank at 15mm, we don't have to go into the same level of detail that we normally need to do because it's so much smaller. So you don't need to worry about highlighting chips or anything like that, but putting chips on there certainly will look very nice. With that dry brushing that we've got on the hull as well, that will act as a kind of highlight to it. So all we need to do here is a little bit of sponging with a dark grey. Now I find German grey from Vallejo is excellent for doing this on this colour scheme, and then after that we're going to add a little bit of a pure black. So here I'm going to use some matte black from the Army Painter. And this is going to be to add some little black patches on things like the muzzle of the gun, for example. But first of all, what we need is German grey, and to apply this, rather than using a brush, go for a bit of sponge, just like this one I've got here, which you can see I've just torn so it's nice and comfortable to hold. I've made sure the end I'm going to be using just on here is really rough and not regular, so it's going to give a natural appearance to things. And to do this, all you've got to do is get some of the paint onto your palette. So you've got some just here. And all we need to do is just pick up a small amount with the end of the sponge like this, and then on your palette just start moving along, dotting it like this to remove the excess paint. And what happens on the palette here is what's going to happen on your miniature. So what we need to do is just make sure that we really go along until there's not much left on there. So we're getting this sort of effect that I'm getting just here. And then with this, what we do is start dotting it onto the miniature in areas where things like chipping would occur, so where scratches would happen, that sort of thing. So for example, around the front of the tank just along here, all we do is look for that sharper edge and just start dotting it on like this very lightly, and you'll see you get that natural appearance of chipping appearing on the hull there like that. Now this is very easy to do, so it's actually possible to get quite carried away with this, so I do recommend that you just keep it moderate so that you don't go overboard with it and make the tank too dark. But you can also bring some little chips up on the flatter areas too, such as just on there, perhaps little impacts from bullets and things on the front. And you can gradually take it along to get a nice appearance to it. So I'm going to carry on doing this onto the hull now and onto the turret as well to make sure they match. As you're doing this, when you get to your decals, it's always a good idea to go a little bit over them too, because it gives a very subtle effect of just helping embed them with the rest of the miniature. Once you're happy with that chipping, the last thing to do is to put a bit of a sort of powder residue on the muzzle of the gun. And for this, all you got to do is just make sure it's nice and braced. And I've got a small dry brush here from Citadel, and I'm using matte black from the Army Painter. And with this, what we do is set up as if you're going to be dry brushing, but instead start stippling it on the end of the gun like this, just dotting it around it. And the more of this you do, you can see the darker it starts to get, and you can build up that really realistic appearance on the end of the gun there like that. You can do this as long as you like to get it to be as dark as you want. Now in addition, you can also do some of this on the exhaust for the engine, and in this case I'm going to be doing it on kind of the engine deck that we got at the back here. Take the turret off so you can access it, and again just start stippling downwards towards this area. And once done this, your Tiger tank is ready for action. And here we have the completed Tiger ready to do battle in North Africa. So as you've seen, painting tanks in this scale is actually very simple because they tend to be very dense in detail and features on the armour, which means they work very well with Citadel's contrast paints. Just remember that contrast paints though, whilst they might appear like a wash at first glance, behave a little bit differently, so when you're applying them, pick a starting point and then move around the whole hull of the tank as quickly as you can, making sure to get a nice smooth finish with the paint. Anyway, have fun painting your tanks, and we'll see you again very soon.